Hello. Today we are wrapping up my first month of reading in the year of our Lord 2021, and it was an interesting month because the first half of the month was incredibly strong reading wise. Like, I had a ton of things that I would consider to be hits, and the back half of the month I had 4 books that I would say, I'm not gonna say I'm in a reading slump right now because, like, girl, I still read I think 27 or 28 books. Let's not get this carried away, but I've definitely like been struggling to do anything other than rereading in recent days, and I think it's because of some books that I did not enjoy as much and them really putting me kind of in a slumpy mood. So with that being said, we're going to start with some overall stats and talking about some of the challenges I've been working on. Then we will move into my disappointments, my surprises, and my hits for the month of January 2021. So let's dive in. So like I mentioned, I did read 27 books this month, and of those 27 books, 14 were from my TBR, so I owned them, and 13 were not, so almost half and half. I read a total of 7,858 pages with an average book length of 291 pages. It's actually lower than I would have thought because I definitely read some chunky books, but I also read some like novellas, so I guess it evens out. The average age of book I read this month was 9 years old, and the average amount of time a book had been on my TBR was 6 months. I paid for only 11% of the books that I read, and my average book cost was only 60 cents. There you go. In terms of where I got books from, actually a very big mix this month because I didn't read very many owned ebooks, so that drove down my Amazon percentage, though I did have a lot of Kindle Unlimited books in there, a good number from publishers, and some ones that were from the library, some that were given to me as a gift, etc. A little bit unusual in terms of my genre breakdown, though this has been true for the last couple of months, I think, which is that my 2 biggest genres that I read were speculative romance and fantasy books. So I read 9 speculative romances and I read 8 fantasy books. I think that has a lot to do with some of the series that I've been working on, but there you go. And on top of that, I read a few historical romances, a couple of mysteries, sci-fi, a little bit of nonfiction, so little bit of everything, but definitely dominated this month by fantasy and speculative romance, which were mostly sci-fi romances. And then in terms of my rating, very bell curvy here, as you can see. So as I said, I had some books I did not enjoy as much this month, so I had a notable DNF, a notable 1.5 star, and then a couple of like 2.5 kind of stars. But then I also had a book I absolutely loved that I gave 5 stars to, and some really strong 4 stars. So it all, I guess, balances out. I happened to read most of the ones that I really loved at the beginning of the month and most of the ones that I didn't love as much towards the end of the month. But one can never predict such things. Then in terms of challenges, so I have a couple of secret TBRs going, so I can't tell you about those, but what did I get done? So I did read a few books from my 21 books I want to read in 2021, and that was Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. I did this as a buddy read. We will talk more about it later, as well as Whose Body by Dorothy L. Sayers, and we will also talk about that one later. Then I did read several, quite a good chunk of ARCs this month. So I read Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard, and I gave a review of that one actually at my mid-month check-in, so I will refer you there. Likewise for The Bachelor Cowboy by Jessica Clare. Both of those were 3.5 star books. Enjoyed them. Beginning of the month reads for me, so I have a review in my mid-month check-in. Then another ARC I read was A History of What Comes Next by Sylvain Nouvelle, and we will talk more about that one here in a little bit. I didn't love that one as much. Burning Girls and Other Stories by Veronica Chenoz was another ARC I read. We will talk more about that one later. And then 2 that I didn't review in the mid-month and I'm not going to talk about in another category, so let me dive into them a little bit here now. Down Comes the Night by Alison Saft. I think I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, and I'm gonna tell you, I think objectively it's probably closer to a 3 star, but it just happened to have a lot of trope candy in it that I really enjoyed. It's a fantasy, it's a YA fantasy that I think has an interesting setup, but I think the execution feels a little bit choppy. However, it happens to have some of my favorite tropes in it. It's a fantasy romance, really. There's a developing romance between our main character, who she is the bastard daughter of a princess, and she is a healer, but she also is like very independent minded, and she keeps getting into trouble with the queen, who is her aunt. And she's also, I should mention, it's a fantasy romance, and it does have a love triangle, but the love triangle is actually queer, which is a little bit unusual. So our main character is bisexual. Her two love interests are between a woman and a man. So I thought that was a little something different than what I've typically seen in a YA fantasy, but I did enjoy all of that stuff. And then really this is sort of like political machinations, but sort of like an isolated close circle mystery, because for reasons she ends up in this isolated manor house where somebody is poisoning people in the house and she has to figure out who done it. So like I said, I think the execution of this one is honestly a little uneven, but it just had so much trope candy that I love that I actually had a really fun time in this one. I actually think that this one reminds me a lot of Four Dead Queens. So if you liked that book, I think you would also probably like this one. And then The Duke Undone by Joanna Lowell. That's another one I gave 3.5 stars to. This one probably more so should be a full 4-star, but just, it was a little too angsty for my personal taste, but quality-wise, this is a very high quality book. It is a historical romance, and the writing, the prose quality alone is just like really lovely. Like, I thought the actual writing was very enjoyable. I think the characters are very well drawn. The setup is basically that our heroine is an artist, and she encounters a duke who is drunk in an alley, naked. She lets the authorities know to come like pick him up and get him home, but she's kind of like transfixed by his naked bod, and she ends up painting a portrait of him, and he finds out about it, and hijinks ensue from there. Like I said, character-wise, I think that these are really well-drawn characters, and I liked all of the ideas of the plot. Like, that's a fun setup, and then there's also a lot of stuff about his family and his family trauma, them working together to try to resolve some of that, as well as her own ambitions for her art career. So like, all of that was good. I just didn't feel like the pieces of it came together as cohesively as I wanted them to, but I would definitely look for more from this author, and she is somebody who I would put with like a Courtney Milan or an Evie Dunmore in terms of like, if you're somebody who really values high quality prose in your historical romance, I think that Joanna Lowell will be a good author for you. So that was the other arc that I got to this month. And then, like I said, I had some secret TBR things going, but is there any other challenges I can tell you about? Oh, I did do a buddy read of The Black Company by Glenn Cook, which we will talk more about. So that was the other kind of thing I quote unquote had to read this month. So with all that being said, let's start with my disappointments, I guess, and get some of this negativity out of the way, because I did have some real disappointments. So let's get into that. First, as I mentioned, A History of What Comes Next by Sylvain Neuvel. This was a disappointment because the idea of this book is really cool. It's basically that it's a sci-fi, it's a historical sci-fi, which I don't think we see a lot of. Like, you see historical fantasy, but you don't see as much historical sci-fi. I don't know. So I appreciated just on its face, like, oh, that's a little different. And the idea is that there's this alien species who has come to Earth, and there are these mother-daughter pairings every generation who are working to help Earth become able to achieve flight. So this is set in like the early 20th century, and we are following these different mother-daughters on their journey to try to help humans accomplish this. That's a cool setup. It's the beginning of a series, and while I think that it's a very purposeful writing choice, like it's a stylistic choice, the stylistic choice that the choices that Sylvain Neuvel makes in this book did not work for me. Like, the writing itself, I really didn't enjoy. I've read and enjoyed a novella from him called The Test, which is why I wanted to try this. I was like, oh, okay, like maybe I'll like a series from him. And I very much enjoyed the writing in that book. So it's not all of his stuff, but the particular way that this story unfolds, it's not to my taste. It's very dialogue heavy in a way that I didn't think worked. And I just didn't really get into this one. When I went and left my review, I went and saw like, what are other people thinking? And it seems like a lot of people are having that experience, even if they've liked his other stuff. So I would tell you, maybe read some sample chapters of it before you fully commit to see if you're gonna like the writing. I think if you like the writing, you'll probably get into the book. But for me, that was just like a big mess. And this is what began me feeling a little slumpy. What I think cemented me feeling more slumpy was The Black Company by Glenn Cook. Now, we did an entire book club of this over on my friend Leanna's channel, so I will link that below for you to see like the full discussion. This is an interesting book in terms of like a piece of genre history, because if you don't know, The Black Company by Glenn Cook is thought by many to be sort of like the proto grimdark fantasy book, and it is cited by a lot of great writers within grimdark fantasy as a big inspiration for them. The ideas of this book I like. I mean, it has a lot of those kind of grimdark themes of like what it like is is there even such a thing as being on the good guy side when you're in war? Like, all war is terrible. It makes people like, it turns people into the kind of people who just will do terrible things and not even feel bad. Like, all of that was really interesting. Apparently it was written as sort of like a response to the Vietnam War. So I think in the live stream we were talking about this and I was like, oh, that's so interesting to think about this response to the Vietnam War versus like what Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings being a response to his experiences in World War I and II. Like, all of that, like, conceptually there's interesting stuff happening here. Also, when I went to look up the synopsis before our live show, because it had been a couple weeks and I was just trying to refresh myself on what happened, I was like, oh, like when the plot is just laid out like this, it's an interesting idea of a plot. The writing of this book is agony. I hated the writing of it so much. It's like, the comparison Leanna was making is that it's almost told as like a recap in a lot of places, which I think is true. I think it's hard to even figure out what action is going on in a lot of places. And maybe I know people who love the series say that the first book is far and away the worst, so it may get better. I had such a bad time with this book. I originally gave it 2 stars, but like basically because I was like, okay, I appreciate what it's done for the genre. But upon reflection, I think I have to give it 1.5 because I just think I think it's like not a good book. I think it's a bad book. That being said, if you're interested in the genre or if writing is something you can kind of get past, maybe you could get into this. Clearly some people have, because there's a lot of people who love this series and it obviously started this whole subgenre, but it just wasn't for me and I will not continue in the series. So that kind of made me feel a little slumpier. Then the 2 books that like really cemented my feeling of being in a slump were Whose Body by Dorothy L. Sayers and A Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. So Whose Body I finished and I gave 2 stars to. This is an inauspicious start to my rereading/reading Dorothy Sayers project because it's the first book in the Lord Peter Wimsey series. There are things about this I liked. I really enjoyed the dynamics between Lord Peter and his servant Bunter. Like, I think all the dynamics between them are great and very Wodehouse-esque. Like, it reminds me a lot of Jeeves and Wooster. So I liked all that. I think the actual writing quality is very nice, which I knew, like, Dorothy L. Sayers is a very strong stylist prose-wise. I think that there's something to the story that I do like. However, it's a novel that very much should have been a short story. I just felt like it got so drawn out and it was so clear who did it that it's like, I don't need to be totally, I've talked about this, I don't need to be totally surprised by a mystery, but like if it's glaringly obvious and we're just sitting here waiting for the story to catch up with what the audience knows, I just don't think that's a very pleasant reading experience. At least it's not for me. And I will say that there is a lot of notable anti-Semitism in this book, which is not uncommon for a golden age of detective fiction books, but is still not pleasant to a modern reader's sensibilities. So I'm gonna keep going, though I am worried, to be honest, now that I have read this book because I did not enjoy it. So we'll see what happens. If I am really not liking books by the second or like, well, I'll definitely get through 3. If I'm not liking it still after the 3rd, I may revisit if I'm gonna keep going, or at least if I'm gonna read all of them, because I'm not one to make myself read things I'm not enjoying. That just goes against my overall philosophy of how I read. So there was that, and then the one that like truly put me not a full slump, but just like feeling slumpy is The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. Now, I'm gonna tell you, I DNF'd this book after about, I think I got to 37%. This book is a book that will work for some people, and it's a part of a blog I'm doing, and I talk a lot more in that vlog about my feelings about it. I don't think that this is a bad book, actually, really at all. I think if I had kept going with it, I probably would have ended up giving it 2.5 or 3 stars. But it is not a book for me because it is so plot driven and there is so little character development. And what character development there is, I think, is very unsatisfying. And in high fantasy, that I am a character driven fantasy reader, and I just did not connect with our main character at all. He was very superficially drawn, I felt. And maybe if I had kept going, I would have changed my mind, but for books that long, I just don't believe in continuing on for the sake of continuing on if I'm not actively having a pretty good time in it. And I just felt like it was so just like action, 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 action. But if you're not invested in the characters to whom the action is happening, that isn't very satisfying as a reading experience, at least not for me. So I think that this could be a book for someone. And there's parts of it I like the ideas about like caste system in it. I like that it is a non-European based civilization. I always get excited when that happens. And I thought the actual like magic system was pretty cool. It just, again, I just didn't have anything to hang my hat on when it came to character development. So I ended up DNFing it, but it took me like 4 or 5 days to get 37% in. And that to me is a signal that I'm not enjoying a book the way I should be. So then moving into more positive territory. So first, The Haunting of Tramcar 015 by P. Djeli Clark. This is the second book in the, I forget what the series is called, but the like Jinn series that he's got going. I have the third full, it's like the first full book, but it's the third entry in the series called A Master of Jinn. And actually it's one of my next things I'm gonna read, which I'm very excited for. I'm doing that as a buddy read with my friend Ashley. Anyway, I love P. Djeli Clark. I love this series. And what surprised me about this book was I wasn't expecting it to be from a different character than Fatma, who we met in the first book. It's one of her colleagues. And I just thought this was a really effective, clever novella. And it just didn't go, it went in a different place than I was expecting it to. So just not a huge, just a note of like, oh, this surprised me. It just was different than the first book, but in a really good way. So small surprise there. Then I wanted to mention Fire in His Embrace by Ruby Dixon because this is the third book in the Fireblood series by Ruby Dixon. And it was my like make or break book in this series. If I hadn't enjoyed this book, I would have not continued in the series. But it surprised me because it finally got a big, like an overarching plot. And I think we finally figured out like what was happening in this world in a way that we hadn't known what was happening up to this point, in a way that I just didn't think was working totally for me. So if you have been so-so on the series, I would say if you can get through the third book, if you're not liking it after the third book, you will not like it at all, I don't think. But if you get into the third book, sorry, had to change the battery. I don't remember exactly what I was saying, but I think I was saying once you get to the third book, you're gonna have a better sense of if you're gonna want to continue on, because by the time you get to the third book, you finally are getting a macro plot and understanding kind of like what's actually going on in this world a lot better. And I think that there's just more conflict baked into this particular premise, because in that third book, the hero has been captured by the baddies, who are also kind of holding on to the heroine. She like is trying to kind of stay in their good graces so she can slither away, sort of a thing. And they are both trying to kind of get out of the situation together. So it just creates some inherent conflict on the front end in a way that I think the other books would have benefited from having, the ones that came before it. And from there, we find out so much more about what's happening. We go to a new place called Fort Shreveport, and we meet more characters, and we have more just sort of like the communal vibe going, which I think is something that Ruby Dixon does particularly well. So anyway, I was like pretty sure I was gonna DNF that series, but that was the book that really turned it around for me, and I only have one more book left, and then I will be fully caught up. So I read several of those this month. I was catching up with that. So that was a pleasant surprise. And then Burning Girls by Veronica Chenoz. Burning Girls and Other Stories, I should say. This is a collection of speculative short stories that are queer and have a lot of influence from sort of like Jewish magic traditions or like lore. And this was not what I was expecting this book to be. I'd asked for it because I saw Jean Bookish Thoughts talking about it in a positive way, the author at least, and I was intrigued, to give it a try. And it's definitely a collection that has hits and misses. It's a lot of very experimental stories, so if you like kind of experimental fiction, I think this would be a collection that would work for you. And some of those experiments are more successful than others, but the ones that are successful are just like fantastic. Like the first story is called, I think, Across the Thorns. Whatever the first story is, probably was my favorite in the collection. I just thought that was an absolutely fantastic short story. I really like this one about this never-ending house that's getting built and the daughter-in-law who's coming into this house. Like there's just some really, I think, really standout stories in the collection, but it's just a lot of very experimental forms of fiction. So it surprised me because I wasn't totally sure what I was gonna get, but then it ended up being very experimental in a way that pretty well for me. So I had not read from that author before, but I would definitely read more of her short stories based on this collection. Okay, and then we get to my hits. So I had 4 books I wanted to talk about as hits. So first, we will start with Royal Assassin from Robin Hobb. This is the second book in the Farseer trilogy, which is the first trilogy in the overall Realm of the Elderlings interconnected series of, I think, like 16-ish books. And this one I liked even better than Assassin's Apprentice. I didn't quite give it 4.5 stars because I think that this book would easily have been a 4.5 or a 5 star if the first chunk of it had been taken out of this book and put into Assassin's Apprentice. I think that would have made Assassin's Apprentice a better book, and I think it would have made this book a better book. But that being said, this is one of the most character-driven, high fantasy adult series that I have ever read, and I am living for it. The character work in this series is just absolutely fantastic. Fitz, the poor, sweet summer child of Fitz, he's such an interesting character, and you do just find yourself rooting for him. He can be a little whiny, but like, I think he has reason to be honest with you, so like, I'll give him a pass. He could not be more clueless about women, which is just very entertaining to watch. Both women he's interested in romantically, as well as just like overall the women in his life and in his family, he just has no clue, which seems to be a family trait actually. So it's interesting because this is a very slow-paced book, but the writing is beautiful. It is engaging throughout. I do think pacing wise it would have been an even better book if like it had been apportioned differently between these two first books, but whatever. It's super character driven, super focused on relationships of all kinds, like romantic, familial, friendship, the love between a man and his adopted pet wolf named Night Eyes, and I absolutely love Night Eyes, and the dialogue between them is fantastic. Me and Leanna just like could not even with Night Eyes. We're obsessed. Yeah, so I think the thing that really stuck out to me is I was reading this the week of the attempted insurrection here in the US, and this book has a lot of political machinations to it, and really the theme of this particular book is, and so often in politics, you know what's gonna happen, and yet you're powerless to stop it because of the politics that are tying your hand. It's just like, like almost from the beginning of this book, you kind of know how it's gonna end. And Fitz kind of, I think, has an idea of how it might end, and yet none of them can stop it from happening, and it's just maddening. So I thought that was really well done. Again, I just love all the characters in this, and the way that this ends on quite, like, this is one of my favorite endings to a high fantasy, like, in a series I've read in a while. Like, this is just really good. So I really enjoyed this. I do think there's some pacing issues, but it's even better than Assassin's Apprentice, and I cannot wait to find out what happens in this third book, and then to eventually get going into the Live Ship Traders trilogy as well. So definite hit. Then another 4-star book was Little Monsters from Kara Thomas. So again, recurring theme here, character work in this was absolutely fantastic. This is a YA thriller, and it's a missing girl thriller, but it's got a different take on the missing girl trope. I gotta tell you, like, I think that this is a much smarter version of a missing girl thriller than I've typically read, to be honest. Like, I think there's just a lot of very cliche things that people do with teenage characters, and Kara Thomas never has caricatures in her stories. So often teens and YA thrillers, but also just adult thrillers that have teen characters, are so world-weary and cynical in a way that I think is not true to how teens are actually cynical and try to be edgelords. Like, it doesn't quite have the right insight often into what that kind of character is like, and Kara Thomas does get that. Like, the way she does those kinds of characters, I think, is really smart, really true to life, and like just is really very effective, very emotionally engaging, and her actual writing is fantastic. The thing that didn't work for me in this is that there is a dual timeline. You guys know I'm always a little iffy on that. And the way it's done is through the diary of the missing girl. And it's just a personal pet peeve when diaries are written in a way that it is basically still an author writing a scene, because that's not how diaries work, and that's just a pet peeve. So every time that came up, even though I liked what was happening in those flashbacks, I didn't like the framing device of them. So I know that's nitpicky, but it took me out of the story every time it happened. So I think that this is absolutely a really, really good YA thriller, just a thriller in general. If you don't usually read YA thrillers, I think this is a good bridging one. Like, it's a more adult version of a YA thriller, so it can be good for YA readers trying to get into adult, or adult readers interested in trying YA. So anyway, I just thought this was absolutely fantastic. Really enjoyed it. And I need to just finish off her other books, because she has, I think, 1 or 2 other ones that I've not read yet. And then my last 4-star pick that was a hit before we get to my 5-star is Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes de Mez. And this book was just so freaking good. It is a historiography of American evangelicalism, and its core argument is that there was a movement in 1800s evangelicalism called muscular Christianity, and there's like I want to launch into a whole thing here, which I won't. Basically, TLDR is that muscular Christianity was like a mode of evangelicalism that saw the decline in evangelicalism's cultural prestige and sort of like cultural influence being attributable basically to like the feminization of the church, or the perceived feminization of the church. Basically, like, not enough men are involved in this, and like the women are running this into the ground, even though if you look at actual statistics, insofar as we have them in terms of church participation, there's not overwhelming evidence that these muscular Christianity movements to like butch up the church have ever actually driven meaningful long-term changes in like whatever. It's a flawed theory, but it's very prevalent and continues to be to this day. And she is basically making an argument that connects that movement in evangelicalism to fundamentalism, but then the neo-evangelicals, represented by kind of like Billy Graham and that crew of the 1950s, having this really vested stake in a kind of militarism here in the US. And she makes connections with Billy Graham that I have never seen somebody making before, things I definitely had not heard about in terms of like how he was very like hawkish on war, and especially like the Vietnam War, how he was trying to get involved in politics in the 1950s in a way that I've never seen someone detail. She just was making connections that I thought were really astute and really contextualized kind of the trajectory of where evangelicalism in America eventually goes by the 1980s, when they are essentially like wholesale starting to buy into political fideism as a core tenet of what it means to be an American evangelical. I know I grew up going to a fundamentalist school, and like Pat Buchanan came and gave rallies at our school. We had to go around and say who our parents voted for. Like, politics was fully a part of your identity as an evangelical. And I think that she really effectively argues as to how and why that happened, specifically after the 1970s and 80s, which is where a lot of historiographies cut off. Hers goes up through basically the present. And I thought it was I'm biased because like my capstone lecture thing that I gave in grad school was making a similar argument about the development of evangelical culture. But so I'm biased that I agree with her thesis going into this, but I just think she argues it really well. And I appreciated having someone actually do the work to have historiography coming up so close to the present. She talks about like Promise Keepers, and she talks about the Mark Driscoll meltdown, and like all of these other things that if you have been in and around evangelicalism, you'll be like, oh yeah, like I think she captures like a lot of what it feels like, I guess, to be in an evangelical subculture, or like in the bubble. So anyway, I just thought that was a really good historiography. It's a little dry, which is why I didn't give it more stars, because I don't think like as a piece of nonfiction, it's especially like beautifully written or anything, but like I think it's definitely very readable, very clearly written, and very well argued. So I definitely very much enjoyed it and would recommend it. It's just, I don't think has like that extra something to make it extra special in terms of the writing itself, but very much enjoyed that and would recommend. But far and away my favorite thing I read this month was the last book in the Percy Jackson series, Percy Jackson and the Last Olympian, and it's book 5, so like I can't really get into the full thing, but you guys, the way the series ends is so freaking satisfying, and I love where do I even begin with this gush? Okay, part the first. I think all of the character work in this is really good and takes all of the characters a step further than I was expecting him to go. Like, I really love what he does, particularly with Percy, Annabeth, and Luke. I thought that was really, really compelling, as well as Clarice. Like, I like the stuff with her. I just loved all the character work. Like, all of it I loved, okay? I love that. I love the actual plot, like how the story gets resolved and like how the story unfolds from the beginning, which is heart-wrenching. Like, the opening scene is a killer, and it just like doesn't let up. Like, the plot I think is fantastic and makes sense for where the story had been building. It's like it does the great things series should do, which is like give you what you want but give it to you in a way that is a little bit surprising so you're still engaged. Like, I think this plot does that. And then thematically, the fact that it's called And the Last Olympian and like what this represents and what it means is freaking beautiful, and like exactly what I would want my 12-year-old to be learning about like what heroics actually are. Oh my gosh, this freaking book, guys. Like, I feel like I can't swear when I'm talking about Percy Jackson. I just love this so much. It's definitely my favorite of the 5. And I'm gonna tell you, I officially am gonna say that I think Percy Jackson is a better series than Harry Potter. I am sure I'm somewhat biased because I'm longing for sure something that I can recommend to people that fills that kind of a void. But I think in terms of the actual construction of the series, it is a better and more thoughtfully put together narrative. Now, I will say the first two books, I'm not sure if he knew where he was going in the first two books, but once you get to the third one, it becomes so clear he has an end game in mind. And the way he executes on that, I think is just really, really satisfying. I think it was smart to not get bogged down into a school year setup in terms of like the timing of how each book has to work the way Harry Potter does. I think that there's so much less like things I have a problem with from like a story perspective in these 5 books as compared to with Harry Potter. So like, I know that this is middle grade, Harry Potter becomes YA. I guess this one kind of does too. It transitions a little bit from middle grade to YA, but I just think, yeah, I'm really excited, pleased that this 100% lived up to the hype for me from what I'd heard about people who love this series. I also love it. I am continuing on the Uncle Rick train whole hog in the middle of the second Magnus Chase book right now. Then once I'm done with Magnus Chase, I'm going to go back and start the rest of the Camp Half-Blood books, Trials of Apollo, Kane Chronicles. Like, I'm going to do it all because I just really love the way he tells these stories. I love that I can happily recommend them to people, and they're just like such a lovely comfort read these days. Like, I have been so using middle grade fantasy as comfort reading, and it just really scratches that itch and hits the spot for me. So anyway, I love this book. It's my favorite of the 5, and I can't wait to keep reading with Uncle Rick. And I'm so excited now for that Disney Plus series whenever it comes out. So yeah, I think that is what I have to tell you about my reading for January 2021. Some highs and lows, and January 2021, I do have to say, just for like recording for the future, this month felt like an eternity geopolitically, also personally, because like some of my meds stopped working, so we've been trying new ones, and that's always a whole thing. So like this month was also just a lot, but it's over now, and hopefully February will not feel as intense as January did. So anyway, let me know how your reading in January went. Let me know what you thought about any of the books I talked about in the comments down below. And yeah, I think that will do it for me. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, along with a link to my Glasses USA affiliated link if you want 65% off your first pair. I'm loving mine. And yeah, I think that will do it for me. I hope you're having an absolutely lovely day today, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!